If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. Truth is so rare that it is delightful to tell it. That is a quote that was said by the subject of this episode. It is a quote that I can find some truth in, obviously, since I do have a history podcast. But I find it interesting that the person that said that quote requested that her truth be turned to ash after she died. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 15th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in Season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled, They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So, while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserved to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Emily Dickinson. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts, United States. Her father was Edward Dickinson and her mother was Emily Norcross. Emily Dickinson had an older brother named William Austin Dickinson and a younger sister named Lavinia Norcross Dickinson. So Emily was the middle child. Her brother went by his middle name, Austin. Emily and her siblings were very close. The Dickinsons were a prominent family, but they were not wealthy. 2 months before Emily was born, her parents and her brother moved in with her father's parents. Their names were Samuel Fowler Dickinson and Lucretia Gunn. In the house, there was also several of Edward's siblings, so it was a full house. Her grandfather helped found Amherst College, but he had money problems. He actually went bankrupt not too long before Emily was born. In 1833, her grandparents moved to Ohio because of their money woes. Emily and her family stayed in the home for another 7 years, but they eventually sold it to someone outside of the family. They got a home on what is now called North Pleasant Street in Amherst. Emily loved the home. Emily was described as a well-behaved child. Her aunt Lavinia said she was, quote, perfectly well and contented. She is a very good child, but little trouble, end quote. Emily had a love and talent for music from a young age, particularly the piano. Not only was Emily close with her siblings, but she was also close with her father. Her mother was another story. This is what Emily wrote to a friend about her mother. This is what the letter said. Quote, "She was an awful mother, but I liked her better than none." End quote. Emily's father wanted his children to be well educated. Emily had an education that was not typical for 19th century girls, but it was typical for girls in Amherst. Emily first attended a primary school that was in Amherst. Then she went to Amherst Academy for about 7 years. Then she went to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which is now called Mount Holyoke College, in 1847. She only stayed there for 1 year, though. This school was in South Hadley, Massachusetts. This was only the second time that Emily was away from her home. It was close to her home, but it still was not home. Emily did not like the school. Her homesickness was a part of the reason why she hated the school, but there were other reasons. She didn't like the strict rules and the invasive religious practices of the school. So Emily did not return for her second year. But when she was in school, she did very well. She was described as being very bright. As a child, Emily was often sick. So sick that sometimes she had to take off from school. Emily started to question religion soon after she left school. She was actually the only one in her family that did not join Amherst's First Congregational Church. Her parents and both of her siblings did, but she did not, though it does seem that she believed in the soul's immortality. Emily wrote this to a friend about never joining the church, quote, "I am one of the lingering bad ones," end quote. Death was something that Emily questioned and was troubled by from an early age. It was probably because she was surrounded by it. She lost family and friends in her youth, including her second cousin and close friend, Sophia Holland. Sophia died in April of 1844 of typhus. This left Emily traumatized. It also couldn't have helped that her home was near the town cemetery. And you can see how that impacted her poetry. If you didn't know this already, Emily was a poet. That was her claim to fame. She was actually a very prolific writer, though only 10 of her works were published in her lifetime. But she wrote nearly 1,800 poems. Here are some examples of how death influenced her writing. This comes from her poem, "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." Quote, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality." End quote. This comes from her poem, "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died." Quote, "I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room, we like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm." End quote. Here is one more example from her poem, "I Felt a Funeral in My Brain." Quote, "I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through." End quote. This is what Emily wrote about the loss of her cousin Sophia. Quote, "It seems to me I should die if I could not be permitted to watch over her or even look at her face." End quote. Her parents became so worried about her depression that they sent Emily to Boston, Massachusetts to stay with family so she could recover. When she recovered, she returned to Amherst. This was the time when Emily became friends with people that she was friends with for the rest of her life. These friends were Abaya Root, Abby Wood, Jane Humphrey, Emily Fowler, and Susan Huntington Gilbert. Another good friend that she had was Leonard Humphrey. He was the principal at Amherst Academy. She was also friends with Benjamin Newton and Henry von Emmons. When she was done with school, she enjoyed doing things like baking and gardening, though she hated cleaning. In her poem, How Many Times These Low Feet Staggered, she talked about the boredom of housework, but also talked about how society fails to see the power in housework. She liked botany. She had an herbaceum. This contained a large number of pressed plants that were identified by their Latin names. When Emily was younger, she was very social. She didn't stay a social butterfly for the rest of her life, though. More on that later. When Emily was a teenager, she wrote this about herself, quote, I am growing handsome very fast indeed. I expect I shall be the belle of Amherst when I reach my 17th year. I don't doubt that I will have crowds of admirers at that age. End quote. We don't know if Emily had crowds of admirers, but we do know that Emily may have at least had one marriage proposal. The man's name was George Henry Gould. George was a classmate of Emily's brother's at Amherst College. The reason why it is said that Emily and George's relationship did not work is because George's prospects were poor, so Emily's father did not want him marrying his daughter. It is also possible that Emily may have dipped her toes into the lady pond. One of Emily's rumored lovers was Catherine Scott Turner Anton. She went by Kate. There was a daguerreotype photo that was found that may be of Emily and Kate together, though there is no actual proof that it is the two women. Emily and Kate met each other around 1859. They became fast friends. The two wrote letters to each other, and Emily even wrote Kate a poem. The poem is called When Katie Walks, This Simple Pair Accompanying Her Side. Here's the poem, quote, When Katie walks, the simple pair accompanying her side. When Katie runs, unwearied, they follow on the road. When Katie kneels, their loving hands still clasp her pious knee. Ah, Katie, smile at fortune with two so knit to thee. End quote. Kate was from Cooperstown, New York, and Kate made multiple trips to go see Emily. In late February or early March of 1860, Emily sent Kate a letter begging Kate to come see her. Emily wrote, quote, I have been a beggar and rich tonight, as by God's leave I believe I am the Lazzaroni's face's haunt. Pursue me still. You do not yet, the slim Kate, distinctly sweet you face, stands in its phantom niche. I touch your hand, my cheek to your cheek, a stroke, you vanished hair. Why did you enter, sister, since you must depart? Had not its heart been torn enough, but you must send your shred? Oh, our condor Kate, come from your crags again. End quote. Kate tried to break off their relationship in July of 1860. She does break off her relationship with Emily in April of 1861 after Emily sent her a lot of letters. Emily took this very hard. By September, Emily began to fear that she was losing her mind. Kate tried to renew the relationship in 1877, but Emily refused to see her. Kate may have not only been the only woman that Emily fell for. Do you remember me talking just a few moments ago about a woman named Susan Huntington Gilbert? She was one of Emily's friends. Susan married Emily's brother, so Susan was also Emily's sister-in-law. I am going to read to you a letter that Emily wrote to Susan. Before I read this letter, you need to know that Emily's sister sometimes went by the nickname Benny. Here is the letter that Emily wrote to Susan on June 11th, 1852. Quote, I have but one thought, Susie, this afternoon of June, and that of you. And I have one prayer only, dear Susie, that is for you. That you and I, in hand as we eve do in heart, might ramble away as children among the woods and fields, and forget these many years and these sorrowing cares, and each become a child again. I would it were so, Susie, and when I look around me and find myself alone, I sigh for you again, little sigh and vain sigh, which will not bring you home. I need you more and more, and the great world grows wider, and dear ones fewer and fewer. Every day that you stay away, I miss my biggest heart. My own goes wandering around and calls for Susie. Friends are too dear to sunder. Oh, they are far too few, and how soon they will go away where you and I cannot find them. Don't let us forget these things, for their remembrance now will save us many an anguish when it is too late to love them. Susie, forgive me, darling, for every word I say my heart is full of you. None other than you is in my thoughts, yet when I seek to say to you something not for the world, words fail me. If you were here, and oh that you were, my Susie, we need not talk at all. Our eyes would whisper for us, and your hand fast in mine, we would not ask for language. I try to bring you nearer. I chase the weeks away till they are quite departed. And fancy you have come, and I am on my way through the green lane to meet you, and my heart goes scampering so that I have much ado to bring it back again and learn it to be patient. Till that dear Susie comes. 3 weeks, they can't last always, for surely they must go with their little brothers and sisters to their long home in the West. I shall grow more and more impatient until that dear day comes, for till now I have only mourned for you. Now I begin to hope for you. Dear Susie, I have tried hard to think what you would love of something I might send you. I at last say, my little violets, they begged me to let them go. So here they are, and with them as instructor a bit of nightly grass, who also begged the favor to accompany them. They are but small, Susie, and I fear not fragrant now, but they will speak to you of warm hearts at home, and of something faithful which never slumbers nor sleeps. Keep them 'neath your pillow, Susie. They will make you dream of blue skies and home and the blessed country. You and I have an hour with Edward and Ellen Middleton sometime when you get home. We must find out if some things contained therein are true, and if they are what you and me are coming to. Now farewell, Susie, and Vinny sends her love, and mother hers, and I add a kiss shyly, lest there is somebody there. Don't let them see, will you, Susie? End quote. Unlike Kate, Susan remained close to Emily for the rest of Emily's life. When Susan married Austin, they moved into the house next door to Emily and Emily's parents and Emily's sister. Emily shared many of her poems with Susan. Emily also wrote this in a letter to Susan. Quote, Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me? I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you. Feel that I cannot wait. Feel that now I must have you. That the expectation once more to see your face again makes me feel hot and feverish, and my heart beats so fast. My darling, so near I seem to you that I disdain this pen and wait for a warmer language. End quote. Emily would compare her love for Susan with other famous historical lovers, like Dante Alighieri and Beatrice Portomari, or Jonathan Swift and Esther Johnson, which I find comparing her relationship with Susan to Jonathan Swift and Esther Johnson's to be very interesting. There are still things that we don't know about Jonathan and Esther's relationship. It is possible that they were lovers, or maybe they were just close friends. They could have also been secretly married, but if they were married, we don't know why that they kept it a secret. Not only did Emily let Susan read her poems, but she also wrote poems about her. This is one of the poems, quote, "One sister I have in the house, and one a hedge away. There's only one recorded, but both belong to me. One came the road that I came, and wore my last year's gown. The other, as a bird her nest, builded our hearts among. She did not sing as we did. It was a different tune, herself to her a music, as bumblebee of June. Today is far from childhood, but up and down the hills held her hand tighter, which shortened all the miles, and still her hum, the years among, deceives the butterfly, and in he eye the violets lie, mouldered this many May. I spilt the dew, but took the morn. I chose this single star from out the wide night's numbers, Sue forevermore." End quote. Susan was the one that dressed Emily for death. Martha Nell Smith is an Emily Dickinson scholar, and this is what she had to say about that. Quote, "Susan's enactment of simple ritual for profound utterance is perhaps best displayed in the simple flannel robe she designed, and in which she dressed Emily for death, laying her out in a white casket, cypripedium and violets symbolizing faithfulness at her neck, and two heliotropes symbolizing devotion in her hand. This final act over Emily's body underscores their shared life, their deep and complex intimacy, and that they both anticipated a postmortem resurrection of that intimacy." End quote. Susan was also the one that wrote Emily's obituary. But just like with the rest of the people that I have covered this season, I will let you decide whether or not there was more than friendship going on between Emily and Kate and Emily and Susan. Emily was influenced by many writers. She was a big fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Her friend Benjamin Newton introduced her to him. He may have also introduced her to William Wordsworth. Lydia Marie Child, Charlotte Bronte, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow were also influences. Emily had a dog. It was a Newfoundland, and she named him Carlo after St. John Rivers' dog. That is a character in Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the poet that wrote the poem about Florence Nightingale that I read in last week's episode. Another writer that had an influence on Emily was a writer that I covered just this season, and that was William Shakespeare. Emily suffered a devastating loss in 1850. Emily's friend, Leonard Humphrey, died suddenly when he was only 25 years old. He died of brain congestion that was probably a brain aneurysm. The young Emily took the loss of her friend hard. This is what she wrote to her friend Abaya Root 2 years after his passing. Quote, "Some of my friends are gone, and some of my friends are sleeping the churchyard sleep. The hour of evening is sad. It was once my study hour. My master has gone to rest. And the open leaf of the book and the scholar at school alone make the tears come, and I cannot brush them away. I would not if I could, for they are the only tribute I can pay the departed Humphrey." End quote. Leonard would not be the only loss that Emily would suffer in the 1850s. On March 24, 1853, Emily's friend, Benjamin Newton, died of tuberculosis. She read about his passing in the newspaper 3 days later. It has been suggested that Emily and Benjamin may have been romantically involved, though this seems unlikely. It's believed that this statement from Emily is about Benjamin. Quote, "When a little girl, I heard a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned." End quote. Emily spent most of her time in Amherst, but in 1855, she took a trip to Washington, D.C. for 3 weeks. Emily's father was a lawyer that ran and then was elected to Congress, so this trip was to go see her father. She took this trip with her sister and mother. After their 3-week stay in Washington, they went to Philadelphia for 2 weeks to visit family. There, Emily crossed paths with Charles Wadsworth. Charles was a preacher that Emily had heard preach. They became friends for the rest of his life. They only saw each other twice after 1855. He visited her once in 1860 and once in 1880, but they wrote to each other a lot. Emily's niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, claimed after Emily died that despite the fact that Charles was married, Emily was in love with him. Emily would call Charles my Philadelphia, my clergyman, my dearest earthly friend, and my shepherd from little girlhood. In the mid-1850s, Emily's mother became ill and she was basically bedridden. Emily cared for her. This meant that Emily did not go out often. Emily used this time to review her poems and piece together manuscript books. In the late 1850s, Emily became friends with Samuel Bowles and his wife, Mary. Samuel was the owner and editor-in-chief of the Springfield Republican. Emily wrote to him often, and she sent him about 40 poems. Samuel published some of her poems in his journal. He published 5. As time went on, Emily became more and more withdrawn. No one knows for sure why. Her doctor said that she had nervous prostration. Some today have tried to figure out what was going on with Emily medically. I have said it before on this podcast, but I will say it again. It is really hard to diagnose someone from the past for a number of reasons. But some believe that she may have suffered from epilepsy and from agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is an anxiety disorder that makes a person think that their environment is unsafe with no easy way to escape. This could include places like shopping malls or any place where there is a crowd or just simply being outside of their home. Some think that she may have been on the autism spectrum, but that is just speculation. Despite the fact that Emily started to become a shut-in, she continued to make friends. In April of 1862, the literary critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly titled "Letter to a Young Contributor." It was advice for writers that wanted to get their work published. Emily wrote to him. She wrote, quote, "Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you the leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dare me to tell me, would you give me sincere honor toward you? I enclose my name, asking you, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true, that you will not betray me. It is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn." End quote. She also sent him 4 of her poems. He told her to keep writing, but she was not ready to be published. He didn't know that she had already been published. But to be fair to him, Emily was never published under her own name in her lifetime. Emily and Thomas exchanged letters, and she started calling him dear friend, and she would sign her letters either your gnome or your scholar. She even told him in 1862 that he saved her life. Thomas was a colonel in the Civil War. He fought for the Union. the Civil War was a time when Emily wrote about half of her poems. She followed the war closely, and the war may have influenced Emily's writing. She has a poem titled "It Feels a Shame to Be Alive." The poem goes, quote, "It feels a shame to be alive when men so brave are dead. One envies the distinguished dust permitted such a head." End quote. She goes on later in the poem, quote, "Are we that weight sufficient worth, that such enormous pearl as life dissolved be for us, and battle's horrid bowl?" End quote. She also wrote 3 poems anonymously in late February and March of 1864 for a Brooklyn newspaper called Drumbeat. This was to raise money for medical supplies and care for the Union Army. The late 1860s were a hard time for Emily. Her beloved dog Carlo died in 1866. She had Carlo for 16 years. He was her first dog, and she never got another dog after his death. That same year, Emily also lost her household servant. The servant had been with her for 9 years. The woman's name was Margaret O'Brien, and she left the Dickinsons because she got married. Emily didn't get another permanent household maid until 1869. Her name was Margaret Marr. During those 3 years without a household servant, Emily wasn't able to devote much time to her poetry because she was now the one, once again, responsible for the household chores. This is when she got really withdrawn. She only left her home if she absolutely had to. She didn't talk to her visitors face to face. Instead, she would talk to them from the other side of the door. Most of the time, when she was seen out, she would be dressed completely in white. In fact, the only article of clothing of hers that is still around today is a white cotton dress. She remained close to her family, especially her brother's children. She actually got along well with all of the neighborhood children. In 1868, Thomas Wentworth Higginson asked her to go to Boston, Massachusetts so they could meet. She told him no. She said, quote, "Could it please your convenience to come so far as Amherst, I should be very glad, but I do not cross my father's ground to any house or town." End quote. He went to Amherst in 1870. This is how he described Emily, quote, "A little plain woman with 2 smooth bands of reddish hair, in a very plain and exquisitely clean white piqué, and a blue net worsted shawl." End quote. He said that he never was, quote, "with anyone who drained my nerve power so much. Without touching her, she drew from me. I am glad not to live near her." End quote. In 1864 and 1865, Emily had to undergo treatment for a painful eye condition. That condition is now known today as iritis. That is an inflammation of the middle layer of the eye. Emily saw an ophthalmologist in Boston named Henry W. Williams. The treatment took 8 months in 1864 and 6 months in 1865. During this time, Emily stayed with her cousins, Frances and Louisa Norcross. This was the last time that Emily left Amherst. The author and Amherst native Helen Hunt Jackson begged Emily to contribute a poem to a volume of anonymous verse. So Emily's poem, "Success is Counted Sweetest," appears in a Masque of Poets. On June 16, 1874, Emily lost her father. He died of a stroke while he was in Boston. Even though the funeral was at their home and so was the memorial service, Emily did not attend either one of them. She stayed in her room with her door cracked open. Emily wrote to Thomas Wentworth Higginson about her father. She said her father's, quote, "heart was pure and terrible, and I think no other like it exists," end quote. On June 15, 1875, Just a day shy of exactly a year after Emily's father had had a stroke and died, her mother had a stroke, but she did not die. This did, however, have a negative impact on her mother's health. It caused partial lateral paralysis and impaired memory. This made caring for her mother much harder on Emily. Emily wrote during this time, quote, "Home is so far from home," end quote. Emily's father had a friend named Judge Otis Phillips Lord. He and his wife Elizabeth were often guests at Emily's home. Otis's wife died in 1877, and after her death, Emily and Otis were in a romantic relationship. Only 15 manuscripts of Emily's correspondence with him have survived, and they are either drafts or fragments, but it appears that Emily and Otis had talked about getting married. He lived in Salem, Massachusetts, and she called him "my lovely Salem." They wrote to each other every Sunday. Emily wrote, quote, "While others go to church, I go to mine. For are you not my church? And have we not a hymn that no one knows but us?" End quote. In another letter, she wrote, quote, "Tuesday is a deeply depressed day." End quote. Their marriage would never be. Otis was critically ill for the last several years of his life, and he died on March 13th, 1884. He was 71 years old. Emily referred to him as our latest loss. That was because he was not the first loss that happened to Emily in the 1880s. The 1880s was actually another hard decade for Emily. On April 1st, 1882, Charles Wadsworth died. He had also been ill for a long time. The next death in Emily's life was her mother's. Her mother died on November 14th, 1882. Emily wrote this 5 weeks after her mother's death, quote, "We were never intimate while she was our mother, but minds in the same ground met by tunneling, and when she became our child, the affection came." End quote. Emily's nephew, Thomas Gilbert, he went by Gib, died after Emily's mother. In the autumn of 1883, Gib got typhoid fever. He died on October 5th, 1883. He was 8 years old. Emily was by his bedside the night before he died. Emily wrote to Susan about Gib's death, quote, "His life was full of boon. I see him in the star and meet his sweet ferocity in everything that flies. His life was like the bugle which winds itself away, his elegy an echo, his requiem ecstasy." End quote. The loss of Gib impacted Emily's health. It was the beginning of the end for her. Emily had to endure one more death. She lost her friend Helen Hunt Jackson. She died on August 12, 1885, of stomach cancer. In the summer of 1884, Emily saw a great darkness coming, and she fainted when she was baking in the kitchen. She remained unconscious for a while. She didn't regain consciousness until late in the night, and after that, her health just started to decline more. Austen even canceled a trip to Boston on November 30th, 1885, because he was worried about her. Emily was bedridden for several months. In the fall of 1884, Emily wrote this, quote, "The dyings have been too deep for me, and before I could raise my heart from one, another has come." End quote. On top of all of that, during this time, her brother had started to distance himself from his family. Austen and Sue's marriage was never really great. And in 1882, Austen fell in love with Mabel Loomis Todd. Mabel was the wife of a faculty member at Amherst College. During this time of loss and sickness, Emily still kept writing poetry, but she stopped organizing them. Emily asked her sister to promise her to burn her papers after she died. What is to believe to be her last letter, she wrote to her cousins, Louise and Frances Norcross. The letter just said, quote, "Little cousins, called back, Emily," end quote. Emily died on May 15, 1886. She was 55 years old. Her cause of death was Bright's disease. This is what Austen wrote in his diary on that day. Quote, "The day was awful. She ceased to breathe that terrible breathing just before the afternoon whistle sounded for 6. End quote. 4 days later, Emily's funeral was held. The funeral was held in the parlor in her home. Pastor Reverend Jonathan Jenkins led a prayer, and Thomas Wentworth Dickinson read one of Emily's favorite poems. It was No Coward Soul Is Mine by Emily Bronte. Thomas looked at Emily before the casket was closed, and he reported some things about Emily. And in this quote that I'm about to tell you, he got Emily's age wrong. He said that she was really 55 when she died. And he also said that Emily's sister Lavinia was the one that put the heliotropes in her coffin and not Susan. So I don't know if Thomas got that information wrong or if the scholar that I quoted earlier got it wrong. But here's the quote, "Edie's face, a wondrous restoration of youth. She is 54 and looked 30. Not a gray hair or wrinkle, and perfect peace on the beautiful brow. There was a little bunch of violets at the neck, and one pink cypripedium. The sister Vinnie put in 2 heliotropes by her hand to take to Judge Lord." End quote. I find it interesting that Emily looked young because she had a quote, "You can stay young as long as you learn." Some of the pallbearers were the president and professors of Amherst College. They carried the coffin out the back door, then 6 Irish workmen that worked on the Dickinson grounds took over. They circled her flower garden, walked through the great barn that stood behind the house, and took a grassy path across houseplots and fields of buttercups to West Cemetery, like Emily had asked. Her grave was originally marked by a low granite stone with her initials EED, but a few decades later, Emily's niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, replaced it with a marble slab that has the message "Called Back." That is a title of a Hugh Conway novel, and it is also what Emily said in her last letter. After Emily's death, her sister Lavinia found her poems. Lavinia had Emily's poems published, and Emily has remained in print since 1890. Lavinia did burn most of Emily's correspondence, like Emily asked her to. But Lavinia became obsessed with seeing Emily's poems published. She turned to Susan and Austen's mistress Mabel for help getting Emily's poems together. There was a feud between the Dickinson and Todd households, and that kept Emily's complete collection of poetry from being published for more than 50 years. Among all of Emily's poems and letters, there were 3 letters that are surrounded in mystery still to this day. Who knows why Lavinia didn't burn these letters, but these letters are known as the master letters. These 3 letters are addressed to a master, but the master is never named. In the first master letter, Emily talks about her being ill and about this master being ill. Emily writes, quote, "Dear Master, I am ill, but grieving more that you are ill. I make my stronger hand work long, to tell you I thought perhaps you were in heaven. And when you spoke again, it seemed quite sweet and wonderful, surprised me so." End quote. In the second master letter, Emily asks for forgiveness. We don't know what she's asking forgiveness for, and she speaks about herself in the third person. She refers to herself as Daisy. She talks about having a love so big it scares her. She writes, quote, "I've got a tomahawk in my side, but that don't hurt me much. Her master stabs her more." End quote. In the third letter, she writes, quote, "One drop more from the gash that stains your Daisy's bosom. Then would you believe?" End quote. She goes on, quote, "Say I may wait for you. I waited a long time, master, but I can wait more. Wait, my hazel hair is dappled. I want to see you more, sir, than all I wish for in this world. Could you come to New England this summer? Would you like to come, master?" End quote. We don't know who the master is in these letters, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to figure out the identity of the master. Maybe it was the Professor William Smith Clark. Maybe it was Henry Emmons. He was an Amherst student that Emily was friends with. Benjamin Newton's name has been thrown out there as a possibility. She did call him master. She even called Leonard Humphrey master in one of her writings. Some people think that it may have been Samuel Bowles. He was the one that published 5 of Emily's poems. Perhaps it was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. She did say that he saved her life. Some think it may have been Charles Wadsworth. Emily's niece did claim that Emily was in love with him. It has been speculated that Susan Gilbert was the master. Some even think that it may have been Judge Otis Phillips Lord. It does appear that the two of them talked about getting married, though the timing doesn't add up. These letters were written in the late 1850s and early 1860s. That is 20 years before Emily and Otis started their courtship. So if Otis was the master, that means that the relationship started before Otis's wife died. So not a lot of people buy into that theory that Otis was the master. Some have even proposed that the master is not human. They think that the master may be God or the devil, or she is talking to a muse. Because Emily did not name the master in the 3 letters, the mystery of the identity of the master will remain unsolved. Emily's poems have been translated into many languages. They have been translated into French, Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, Persian, Kurdish, Turkish, Georgian, Swedish, and Russian. In Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, Emily is featured. Emily's poems have an important role in the novel and film Sophie's Choice by William Styron. The film and novel The Piano by Jane Campion and Kate Pullinger were inspired by Emily's poetry. Many composers have set Emily's poems to music, including her cousin Clarence Dickinson. A public garden in Paris, France is named Square Emily Dickinson. I think Emily would love that. The films A Quiet Passion and Wild Nights with Emily are about Emily's life. So is the TV show Dickinson. Taylor Swift said her songs can be divided up into 3 categories: glitter gel pen, fountain pen, and quill pen songs. This is what she said about her quill pen songs. Quote, "If my lyrics sound like a letter written by Emily Dickinson's great-grandmother while sewing a lace curtain, that's me writing in the quill genre." End quote. She said that her song Ivy would be a quill pen song, and that song was used in the TV show Dickinson. And in a full circle moment, it was recently discovered that Emily and Taylor are distantly related. And that was the life of Emily Dickinson. Thank you so much for listening to the 15th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode is going to be about Rose Cleveland. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode that I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you'll get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, Plus, you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the Zippa Putty. You can also take out ad space. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. You can also click on one of the affiliated links. There's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just said will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to just continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.